The Elgato Facecam Mark II has received the biggest glow up of any device that I've ever seen. This is just a night and day transformation in image quality. Here is the TLDR of what has changed with the original Facecam and Facecam Mark II. First of all, there are much improved colors, as you can see. It's crazy. Secondly, Facecam Mark II has HDR. There's also 720p 120 frames per second, which has been added. And there's a privacy cover built in, so it's not just this little cap that you can put on the original Facecam. There's actually one right over the lens that you can slide like that. Just be really careful not to actually touch the lens. But yeah, both of these webcams have an 84-degree field of view. Technically, the original Facecam's 83.2. but it says 84 on the Facecam Mark II if you actually are in the camera hub settings. So the specs on Facecam Mark II are very similar to Mark I, but there are some improvements. So as far as optics, they're basically the same. This is a fixed focus webcam. So if I hold something up to the webcam, hold it back, you can see that everything kind of stays in focus. But when you get farther than the focus range, which is 11.8 to 47.2 inches, once you're outside of that, things start to get a little bit blurry. 1/2.5 inch sensor, so not very big at all. Full frame equivalent focal length of 24 millimeters. I don't know exactly what the focal length really is, not advertised, but the aperture is f2.4. So the original Facecam has very similar properties when it comes to focus and when it comes to the actual sensor size. But there have been a lot of tweaks under the hood that you can't really see in the specs itself. As you can see at the upper left, Facecam Mark II can do 1080p 60 frames per second, YUI2 uncompressed. Then the original Facecam, 1080p 60 frames per second, but it's UI-VY. Now, I'm not sure if the actual format is what's causing such a drastic change in the colors, but I just think that Elgato has improved their color science. Either way, I'm going to talk about the builds of both of these devices and then really dive into the image quality. So both of these have all plastic builds, not very big. Something that's changed about these devices is the monitor mount. There was a very confusing monitor mount that actually, if you were able to tweak it properly, you could tilt this left and right, up and down, and you could have really good control over it, but it was very confusing as to how to actually do that. So they added a new one. These both have USB-C to USB-A cables. It's USB 3.0. Now the Facecam Mark II can actually do USB 2.0 now if you need it. But if you do that, the 1080p 60 is going to be capped at MJPEG. YUI2 makes the colors a whole lot better. I love the new privacy shutter that's built onto the device because this one here, it's really easy to lose and it just didn't click on that well. Also, something that you can only really see in lower light, this probably has to do with manufacturing, is you can see little specks like sparkles on the original Facecam when it's super low light. And I think that is dust inside the lens itself. There's nothing that you can do about it once you actually have it. Facecam Mark II, I have not seen this with. So let me really dive into the image quality. Something that I really like about reviewing webcams is that the quality speaks for itself. Now, I don't usually call out things like this, but in some of Elgato's videos, I've been reading the comments and some of the people were talking about how the Mark I looked better than the Mark II. And I see that it's possible to come to that conclusion if you have absolutely no reference point. If you've never seen me in real life, which 99.9% of you never have, you wouldn't really know which one looks more like my actual skin. You wouldn't know what my wall looks like. You wouldn't know what this microphone looks like. You wouldn't know what any of these colors really look like. So the best thing that I can do is I can give you a reference point. This is a $750 camera. This is the Sony ZV-1. It's not technically mirrorless. I was calling it mirrorless. That was my mistake. This is actually a point and shoot camera. So let me show you with this. This is my Sony ZV-1 at 1080p 60 frames per second, and this is extremely accurate. I have a mirror that's right next to me so that I can see myself and really monitor myself how I actually look. If you want a reference point for what the color should look like, what I'm looking for in bokeh, what I'm looking for in sharpness, all that stuff, compare it to this image because this is the best looking image of anything that I have. Is better than any of my webcams, of course. So when you use that as an actual baseline, then you see, wow, the browns are just so much better. They really worked hard on the skin tone for the Mark II. The contrast, it's not so extreme. Now, normally I actually do drop the contrast down a lot on the original Facecam, so I can show you right now it's at 30%. And if I drop this all the way down to 0%, it gets a little bit better, and it's something that I do enjoy, but I just want to show because it was default at 30%. I make tweaks on webcams all the time. I used to have a lot of videos talking about it, and I'll make some more in the future. But Facecam Mark II is able to get a lot of good detail in some of the darker colors, and the highlights on my face aren't way too blown out. Now, it does have a little bit of that gray kind of look to it. I'd say that's the only thing that I don't really like about Mark II. Like, everything just looks a bit washed out. Now, you can kind of change this if you alter the contrast. It's already at 70%. And if I move this up a little bit higher, but it doesn't really change it too much. It always kind of has just a little bit of that. but still vastly improved over the original Facecam. Now, I've seen people talk about, oh, the sharpness is better on the original Facecam. Well, that's not entirely true. So with the original Facecam, to achieve this look, it's got to be at +2 on the sharpness. If you drop this down, we get a lot softer, and it's kind of an extra added gritty look to the image. So if you see that full screen, you'll really start to see where it's problematic. Also, this is with the noise reduction filter off, so it's really grainy, and you'll see this especially at low light. But when you turn the noise reduction filter on, it softens my face. So if we were to put this at 0 and the noise reduction filter here, it's just an incredibly soft image that just looks smeared over. So yeah, it's able to get sharper, but it's at, you know, a pretty big cost. Whereas on Facecam Mark II, I'm able to get a really good looking image at just 50% of the sharpness, and I have the noise reduction filter on. So if I was able to take this off, then it does get a little bit sharper, but it gets a little bit grittier and grainier. And this is kind of something that you're gonna have to deal with when you have a sensor that's this small. You kind of gotta work with what you've got. But that grain is pretty intense. Now, you can bring the noise reduction filter all the way to high, which is a lot less distracting, and it's going to be down to you which you want, more sharpness and more grain, or if you want to bring it something like in the middle, maybe light or medium, something like that, where you have a lower amount of grain, not completely gone, but still sharp enough. So I think medium is pretty good. And when I go back over to the original Facecam, then you'll see how intense that grain really is and how big of a difference it is. And I want to touch on the software, because the software's been getting a whole lot better. It's already great, but they use actual values that real cameras are using. Even like, you know, the Sony Z1, it has the same kind of meters and stuff like that, like the same numbers as far as like the shutter speed, 1/60. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, you gotta double the shutter speed to the frame rate. That is valid in certain frame rates, but when you get to 60 frames per second and over, it doesn't really matter very much. If you're at 30 frames per second, yeah, having it at 60 is probably a good idea. But if you have it to 120, for example, all you're gonna really have the effect of is that you're gonna have to increase the ISO, which is gonna increase the gain. So it's like you're kind of better off keeping it at 60, and it doesn't really change the motion blur here that much in a positive way, because it's already such a smooth looking shot at 60 frames per second that it's not really that needed. Anyway, all these controls are excellent. I like how you can control the white balance and change the noise reduction and all this stuff. This is all stuff that's been in the original Facecam, and I was really impressed with the software the entire time. I might make a new guide talking about this, because now there's Facecam Mark II and there's Facecam Pro. Now, something that Facecam Mark II has is dynamic range. You can change it to high or you can change it to standard. Now, interestingly, there is not tint control. I thought this was really strange, a strange omission, but Facecam Pro actually has the ability to, first of all, it has autofocus, so that's actually a big change, but it also has tint control. So let's say I have this at 45 right now. I can drop this a little bit lower, and this will make it more green. So I can really dial this in exactly how I want. I don't have it dialed in perfectly for this video specifically, but there is no tint control on the Facecam Mark II. Here's a quick demonstration of the 720p 120 frames per second option on Facecam Mark II. There's not a lot of use cases for this as far as live video, because if you're streaming on a lot of platforms, you're stuck at 60 frames per second. Really, it's going to be if you're recording a video and you wanted to record something and then you wanted to slow that clip down, you can get a pretty cool effect. That's kind of a niche use case, but it's cool. But something that 120 frames per second is able to do is allow for 60 frames per second HDR. So this is with HDR off right now. If I turn HDR on the Mark II, it doesn't really do a whole lot to help this shot when it's in a decently lit, like a well lit area, and there's no backlight. You see, it just kind of makes me softer. What it's doing is exposing for like really bright areas and the really dark areas, and then stitching those together. It does that every other frame, and that's why it needs 120 frames per second to do it, to get it to actually work at 60 frames per second. This is why other webcams on the market can't actually do HDR at 60 frames per second. It ends up being 30 frames per second, and it really messes up the motion blur. This one does not have that issue. This actually looks really good. It does a really good job, honestly. If you're lit by like a window behind you, which you shouldn't be, but if you have like a window behind you and then some studio lights in front of you, I know a lot of streamers are in environments where they just kind of have to do what they can, and if you are one of those, then this HDR could really help you, and it looks a lot better than the other HDR implementations, because this one can actually still do 60 frames per second and doesn't have that weird warping with motion blur. The low light performance has been improved drastically on the Mark II as well. The grain on the original Facecam was out of control, so much out of control that even on my CPU, it's a 7900X, the grain is so much that it like overloads the encoding of OBS, which is like, it doesn't actually freeze it, it just slows down how long it takes to encode it, but it's insane. But the grain has been massively reduced. Now overall, my verdict should be very clear. Elgato did an amazing job. Basically everything that I talked about before that I didn't like about the original Facecam, the grain, the grittiness, the low light performance, all that stuff, so much better in Mark II.